A very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me. Been having a little bit of a cough, and today I'll be talking about externalities and its implications on policies. So I hope today's session is not really about any data analysis, but my purpose is really to try to provoke some thoughts into how we understand externalities. Right. So when a student asks you what is externality, we're all very familiar with the definition, right? It's the action that one economic agent affects another economic agent, right? And this welfare effect is outside the market mechanism. We know that it violates the first theorem, the first welfare theorem, right? It results in inefficiency. And policies interventions are required to correct this externality. So, in an externality, cost is transferred from the polluter to the victim. Yeah? But I want to also propose an additional way of perceiving externality. And that is, there are two states, right? The first state is that you have an externality and you have no reduction in pollution. The counterfactual is if you reduce pollution, you incur in cost, there is no pollution. Right? So there is actually an underlying implicit subsidy that is caused by the externality. And this is a perspective that's proposed by Template and Faber. So the implicit subsidy refers to the retained dollars which could have been spent on pollution otherwise, right? Pollution control otherwise, right? It's also perceived as the increase in profits from polluting. So the polluter benefits from polluting. So society suffers, health suffers, and from a cost-benefit analysis, if you take into account the cost of the externality plus the increase in profits by the polluter, right? What is the net effect? The cost of the externality actually went down, correct? The cost of externality is the pollution minus the increase in profits. Right? That is the net cost of externalities. So if you consider the profits that the producer and the polluter enjoys, right? Externality goes down, but it's of course not a very clear-cut case where there is a unilateral transfer of pollution, of cost, from the polluter to the victim. Okay, there are more circuitous pathways, right, than just a simply transference of cost. And this is a summary proposed by Costanza, working on the previous work by Faber. So for example, there is this issue of pollution inequality, right? Polluters in general having enjoyed the subsidy, right? They impose a cost on the rest of the population, right? The benefits of kind of too small, right? Increases healthcare costs, eventually it reduces productivity, increases unemployment, right? And eventually, right, there is this inequality that redistributes powers back to the polluter, right, which results in more externality. So there is a feedback mechanism that's proposed. Okay, so the effects of negative externalities on quality of life, right, it's not just the net cost of externality, but there is this feedback loop that happens. So I will just go through some perhaps quite relatable examples of consumption externalities that we observe in, say, around us on an everyday basis. Okay? So consumption externality differs from production externality. It is me consuming a good affecting you and I don't care about the implications on you. Right? So examples Could be education, which generates a positive externality, green preferences. Secondhand smoke is an example of negative externality that we always see, right? And there is also reckless driving. These are just a few examples. And as over the years, we live closer and closer, we interact more closely with one another. The population density increase, the infrastructures in the country increase, right? We start to see increased conflicts as a result of externalities. Right, so this issue of smoking at windows have been coming up quite a lot in the Parliament in the past 1 year plus. Right, it's an example of negative externality that is easy to understand, but it's difficult to resolve. Right. So of course, it's not unique to Singapore. It's happening in Tokyo. Another example of externality. This is quite interesting. It is some opposition to the development of columbarium and temple, right? It could be because of the potential ritual air pollution that occurs, right? It could be externality that is perhaps not from the physical realm, you know. They're worried about whatever superstitious, for other superstitious reasons, right? So these are possible and very interesting aspects of externalities that we see people becoming increasingly concerned about. So another example is this article that just came up, I think less than a week ago, is right when we take trains, we take buses, and what we are often quite bothered by is people who play their phones at full volume, right, trying to watch their videos. And then, I mean, in other examples, when I take buses, sometimes there are people who are clipping their nails, right? And these are all negative externalities that we experience on a daily basis, right? It's not just environmental issues, right? It are just, there is also the issue of social grace, right? Behaving in courteous ways, right? This very interesting case that came up on Storm. Singaporeans are now known for picking our noses in public. Then there is not returning our trays. And there's a very interesting example. This is this case of having an overgrown garden in the balcony, right? So perhaps this is an interesting example because perhaps it started out as a positive externality, and when the production of positive externality increase beyond a certain level, it becomes a negative externality. So of course, it's not limited to the examples I've raised, right? The activities in common spaces. Nowadays, we are starting to see more and more funerals, aside weddings, right? Avoid decks because there's just running out of space, right? I'm always affected by the burning of Jaws paper, so I don't have to look at the calendar. Every 1st and the 15th of the month, right? Full moon and new moon, my nose will start to leak, right? So these are ways that externalities affects us. And the textbook offers a set of policy instruments, and I just want to go through them so that we can identify some peculiarities, right, when we apply these instruments to the case of externalities that we experience every day. So the first type of instruments are economic instruments that work through the price mechanism, right, be it private sector solutions, right, dealing with incentives. That's our cost theorem, right? We allow the parties that are involved to negotiate, right, and if they can negotiate without transaction costs, right, it can lead to a price correction, right? Everyone will be happier. There's a parental improvement, right? Of course, certain conditions must be met before the cost theorem can apply. So conditions include, say, enforcement of property rights, low transaction costs, right? And the literature would suggest that more small-scale localized externalities are easy to resolve, right? You have two people negotiating, it should be resolved in some way because both our welfare can be improved through compensation, right? So that's the advice that, you would receive, right, if you are complaining about your neighbors smoking at the window, is that you should have direct, friendly discussions with them, right? And eventually, we see that it doesn't work, right? There's this recent case in which the neighbors were so frustrated with the smokers downstairs, they started throwing things at the service yard, right? And eventually, the smokers sued the neighbor upstairs, right? So even if most of the conditions are met, it's not easy to implement some of these solutions that we often come across in the literature. So another one is economic instruments that are incentives-based, right? And that's the public sector solutions. That's using price and quantity controls or a combination of both. Taxes, subsidies, cap and trade are some examples that we always see. So the issue with this is that the lack of information can lead to regulatory failures, right? Over subsidizing, over taxing, right? Can yield even more inefficient outcomes than the initial state, right? So the question I sometimes get is, how do we design carbon tax, right? And it's not easy to set up optimal tax rates, right? Because the estimation of tax rates depends on the true cost of carbon, right? And we know that the impacts of carbon on the climate, the impacts of climate on biodiversity, they are all quite complex, quite extensive, and to put a value to that is no simple task. So other than economic instruments, we also have non-economic instruments, such as advisory and moral suasion, trying to persuade other people by appealing to their morality, right? And it's also closely linked with the provision of information and education. So an example that you probably see when you take trains is nowadays there's this unawkward campaign, right, that's trying to increase the community integrations of people with disabilities. So this is an example. Right? Nudging and choice architecture, trying to sway people's choices, right, without altering their available options. So installing of smart water meters, right? Nowadays, some apartments, you can actually check your daily water usage, right, through the app. And then there are also other regulatory and legal measures, and this is interesting, right? Command and control. When we apply command and control instead of economic instruments, which are more effective, that works through the price mechanism. Okay, so if you think about it, right? One example where you use command and control is where all the other instruments don't work, right? Take the case of table littering, right? Not returning your trays, right? I mean, it sounds like a problem that moral suasion could work, okay? But apparently, right, Singaporeans are not very keen on returning their trays when we appeal to their courtesy, right, and consideration for others, right? So now we have a $300 fine. And other examples of command and control, you are not allowed to play loud music after late hours, right? In late hours. So maybe at 12, you can't, maybe after 10, you can't play loud music, right? Because it affects your neighbor's sleep, but you can smoke at the window. So that's the irony here, right? That if the regulation of externalities is based on economic costs, okay, then we should not allow activities that are more costly, right? We should not allow people to smoke at the windows, which affects the health of the neighbors, right? Playing loud music could affect sleep, but I would expect that the cost would be much lower. So other examples, right, is when we use command and control is when the social costs are too high. So, for example, we can't tax drugs, illicit drugs, right? Because illicit drugs are extremely harmful to society, we have to put a ban on them. We can tax cigarettes, okay? And in other cases, like our infamous chewing gum sales ban, right? is also deemed that the social cost of chewing gums on the transport system is extremely high, right? When people throw away their chewing gums at train stations, right, and causes malfunctions. So these are all ways when social costs are high, we implement command and control. Okay, but I mean, with so many instruments, the question is what to choose. And if you look at the literature, there's really no clear-cut economic framework for which instrument choice to employ. Right? There's always a mix and differentiated levels of instruments. So I want to return to the first example that I started out with. Right? I provided a very simple illustration. I said that if a polluter imposes a cost on a victim, the polluter benefits. Right? That is why there is this incentive to pollute. Okay? So I want you to consider another scenario, right, in which the polluter, by causing more pollution to others, decrease their own profit. Right? And standard economic theory would predict that that would be not a rational thing to do, right? If generating externality reduces your own welfare, then what is the point of creating the externalities? Well, it's not really the point, but we observe behaviors that are that follows this pattern, right? That the more you pollute, the lower your profits. Right? These are what is coined as externalities with internalities by Alcott. Okay, so internality is defined as costs that we impose on ourselves by taking actions that are not in our own best interest. Right? In other words, one can think of internalities as externalities that we impose on ourselves. Okay? So what this means is that correcting the externality using a text, provision of information, the other instruments that we have, command and control, right, can yield an internality dividend. So what this means is that by reducing your externality, you also reduce your cost, your internal cost. Okay? So this has been applied to the energy sector, in particular the energy efficiency sector. And what has been observed is termed as the energy paradox by Jeff and Stevens. So there is, it's often observed that there is underinvestment in energy efficiency for electronics and durables. Okay? So there is an externality cost on the environment. There is also an internality cost to oneself. Right? By underinvesting in energy efficiency, you are creating more emissions, but on the other hand, you are also increasing the lifetime monetary cost of your durable good. So an example is you purchase a refrigerator that's not energy efficient, right? And the refrigerator might be cheaper at purchase, but over the course of the lifetime, the total cost is actually higher. Right? So you are polluting more, you are producing more pollution, you are also increasing your own cost. So the literature suggests there are two main reasons. There are two main reasons as to why there is such a energy efficiency gap, right? The first reason is cognitive constraints, that people just cannot calculate the future benefits and costs, right? They are not very salient of our operating costs. They focus too much on the purchase price of the appliance. Okay, there's also self-control problems. There's also impulsivity or just the lack of ability to calculate the numbers. The other main reason is that there is information asymmetry. There's not enough information about future costs. There's not enough information about how long your appliance will last. There's not enough information about what is the price of electricity going to be in the future. Right? So you cannot really calculate your life cycle cost. So as a result, you made the wrong purchase, right? You increase carbon emissions, you also increase the cost to yourself. So this is the global cost curve, and you can see that on the y-axis is the abatement cost. And anything that lies below the x-axis, right, are all ways that we can reduce carbon and reduce our own cost. Okay? So, which is in contrary to what usually happens, right? You have to abate pollution, you have to incur a cost. Here, you receive a benefit for reducing pollution. And if you look at the items that are proposed, so this is a slightly dated diagram, but most of the items that are below the x-axis, right, lies in the residential sector, replacing your lamp, retrofitting your heater, right, are all ways that we can increase our efficiency and yet gain from it in monetary terms. So the issue of internality, right, people not behaving in their own best in the best ways for their self-interest, right, it's not a problem for the market, right? You can do whatever you want to do to yourself, right? So, but correcting internalities can increase individual welfare. So externalities with internalities provides a strong case for intervention, right? Because if you correct the internality, you also correct the externality. You increase the payoff to the individual, you also reduces any negative externality that the individual produces. So it's a win-win case, okay? So say if you were to ban or tax energy inefficient durables, right, it benefits also the consumer, right, who are in any case underinvesting in efficiency, right? Or you can adopt a less patternistic regulation approach, and that is to fill in the information gap, right, providing information nudges, right, to preserve and also enhance individual choices. And that is to increase the saliency of the internality to the consumer, right? We make it more obvious that they are underinvesting in energy efficiency. So one example is our energy labels that we see, right? If we look at the energy label, it provides you information on how much you're going to save as opposed to something that is less efficient. And if the consumer is able to see that, right, then regulating the externality does not require other policies. It's self-guided. We have the incentive to reduce the externality, which we are previously not concerned about. So the question here is that what do we tax, right? So energy efficiency is good for us. Regulating it, increasing the adoption of energy efficiency, right, increases welfare to the individual, increases welfare to the public, right? And I want to raise another example, which is the case for, say, sugared drinks. Should we tax sugar drinks, right? There is a strong case for the internality argument, right? But the externality argument, you have to establish that imposes social cost on the rest of society, okay? So in a study by our court and colleagues, they found that it is beneficial to tax this kind of demerit good, which has a small externality effect but large internality effect. Okay? And the setting of the optimal tax rate ultimately depends on three things. The first is the degree of externality, the uninternalized health system costs from diseases caused by sugary drink consumption. Number two, the internalities, right, the cost to consumers themselves from consuming too much drinks. You consume, you affect your own health. This is the internalities. And the third one is interesting, is our regressivity. Right? That the empirical studies have shown that most people who suffer from internalities tend to come from the lower income groups. Again, if you were to tax internalities, right, you would be regressively taxing the lower income groups. Okay, so this is one of the conditions that has to be considered when imposing such a tax on externalities with internalities. So in general, such taxes could be beneficial. Right, so what about the other externalities that involve internalities? And if you think about it, what are externalities that involve internalities? Many of them, right? If you preserve the environment, right, reduce externality, it also has implication on what is the benefits of the environment to you. It affects your internality, your level of investment, whether it's adequate in preserving the environment, right? If you think of it from business perspective, say, firms who, consumers who demand, right, firms that are environmentally conscious, okay? So if the firm chooses to preserve the environment, the firm chooses to identify as the green firm, right, they earn internality dividends as well. By investing in reducing their environmental externality, they are also able to get a larger market share, increase their revenue, right? So this is also an interaction between internality and externality. Another example is, say, drunk driving. Anyone who drives drunk clearly does not consider the externality. It also does not consider their own cost, right? So there again, there is an internality problem, right? So I want to draw a parallel comparison to smoking. The case of investments in energy efficiency versus smokers. We know that people underinvest in energy efficiency, right? They cannot recognize the benefits of investing more, right? Adopting more efficient appliances. The case of smoking is similar in a sense that smokers also has an internality, right? They want to reduce smoking. Every smoker that you speak to at some point in time, they will say, I want to quit smoking, right? Like Mark Twain says, quitting smoking is the easiest thing to do. He has done it 1,000 times, right? So smoking is something that the individual desires to do, right, but often underinvest in. So their action is not optimal for themselves. It also creates external cost to the others. And this is largely due to self-control problems, myopia, imperfect information, and behavioral economics has suggested some solutions to reducing smoking. Right? We have our information provision, we have taxes that we know, right? We have regulatory of where smoking is allowed and prohibited. Right? But what can we perhaps learn from the application of externalities with internalities in the energy market to other externalities that we face on a daily basis? The first thing is that the estimation of the optimal policy has to take into account internality. The objective function has changed, all right? It's not just about the externalities that we are often so concerned with, right? There is a proposed internality targeting principle, right? When they try to find the optimal combinations of multiple instruments based on the average internality of the consumers, marginal to each instrument they use. And again, this is developed by Alcott, and this is applied to the energy paradox. So the main findings of the model, there is a long mathematical proof that's provided in the paper to show how estimation is done. But overall, the intuition is that we should not be taxing at the marginal damage level. That's what we always teach, right? Taxes should be equal to marginal damage. But taxes should be slightly below marginal damage while we subsidize the internality. In other words, we should tax the externality slightly lesser, we should subsidize the internality a little bit more. right? And also consumers who undervalue energy costs are often not responsive or less responsive to energy taxes. So what does it mean for, say, smokers? Okay, that means that smokers who underestimate the cost of smoking are often will not smoke less if you raise taxes. Okay, instead of taxing more on cigarettes, I would actually propose that reduce the tax on cigarettes and increase its expenditure on cessation efforts. Right? And if you take the example of the energy efficiency gap, what works in encouraging individuals to buy efficient appliances is also not informing them about the externalities they produce, but highlighting, making it salient, their internality they experience. Right? So if you want people to smoke less, I would envision that if you tell them that smoking affects their neighbors, they wouldn't care much about it. If you tell them that smoking shortens their lifespan by on average 7 years, they might care a little bit about it. But what I think is really useful is a quantification of the extent of lifetime cost, just like we do for electrical appliances. Right? If we can quantify, if you tell a smoker, at the end of your life, you're going to spend $200,000, you're going to be $200,000 less than your non-smoker friends, right? Not just telling them there are health impacts, but really quantifying the cost to them, making salient the internality dividend. This could, if it can be comparable to the use of, say, energy labels for appliances, right? This could discourage smoking, right? On top of all the other efforts that are already in place. So that brings me to some of my final comments. I do believe that externalities will become a bigger problem in the years to come, right? Just because we are living closer together, we are affecting one another, right? We have a high expectation of what life should be, right? What are our rights? And addressing externalities with internalities will also become more important in the future. And these are externalities that also is associated with an internality, because solving these externalities with internalities will increase quality of life significantly, right? And in the optimization of policies, one should also consider the extent of internalities. But of course, I have made a pretty simple, simplified description here without considerations of, say, legality constraints, right? And I hope this makes you think, right? Also about how well received it will be by the public, right? You can see from the picture on the right, right? The perception of fairness, right, will affect public acceptance of a certain policy. So these are some of my thoughts on externalities, and I hope it helps you to think through, right? What are the inconsistencies and what are the possible ways we can reduce externalities that we face on everyday life, and if you have any thoughts, I'll be happy to share them with you. Right? So that's all. Thank you.